So I want to thank each and every one of you for coming to be a part of this author meet and greet. My name is Caitlin, and I'm a library tech here at the Public Library. And it's an honor to be here to introduce Lauren, the author of our YA novel, Outcast. So for those of you who don't know Lauren's an actor, teacher, and writer living in Vancouver, BC. Originally from Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, she moved west after university to pursue a career in acting. For the last 10 years, she has primarily been working as an acting teacher in elementary and middle schools, occasionally writing scripts to be performed on stage. The transition to novelist was not easy, but was aided by the knowledge and love of storytelling that theater gave her. Her first novel, Outcast, was largely inspired by her students. So Lauren, the first novel I ever read and fell in love with was a story about an emerald fairy girl. So when I found out I was going to be able to host the meet and greet for this magical story about a fairy, I was thrilled. And I think the imagery that you used to bring this magical kingdom alive was fantastic. I didn't put the book down for the first 90 pages, and it was only until my son was begging for dinner did I stop. I think it's a fantastic book, not only for young adults, but for adults as well. So thank you so much for being here, and without further ado, Lauren Hillman.
Thank you, Katie. I'm glad to hear some adults have read it. So I'm going to read a few brief excerpts today from the book. I don't want to do any spoilers for anyone who hasn't read it yet. So I am going to start with something from chapter 1, which is called Marissa. She's my lead. She's my protagonist. And what you will probably need to know before we start here is the one thing Marissa doesn't have in her life is any knowledge of her beginning or her birth. Beginning is what they call it here in Fairyland. And your beginning is how you know what type of fairy you are, type of magic you can do. It's basically your entire identity. And so she forms a theory that she's a changeling, which is highly illegal, and gets her shunned by all of the villagers in her tiny town. So eventually she decides to go searching for her past, and that's where I'm going to read from right now. She chose a direction and started off. For a long time she saw nothing of particular interest, although everything was interesting to her. She watched a butterfly float past and nodded a courteous hello. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and she was overcome once more with the feeling of being watched. Then something glistening on a tree caught her eye. She headed towards it, entranced by its glow. The glistening substance started high on the tree and looked like it had dripped down, freezing as it trickled. She touched it cautiously, expecting it to be cold, but in fact it was warm and sticky. Curiosity and that sweet smell got the better of her, and she licked her fingers. Yes, it was delicious. She began licking the sap in earnest, unaware of everything else in the forest. She barely noticed as the humming grew louder and the wind intensified. Finally, sated with sugar, she leaned back against the tree with a smile. Immediately, she jumped back up, in part because the tree was sticky, but also because a gigantic pair of eyes was staring back at her. So that's one of my favorite moments, is when she, of course I just lost the page, is when she meets Chippen, the hummingbird. He is going to become one of her first ever friends in Fairyland, or at least that in our story. You will learn later that she has more from her past that she doesn't know about. Now I ripped my post-it off and have to find where I was planning to start again. Well, I'll start wherever, I guess. This is the first time she meets Chippen, the hummingbird. I'm going to highly encourage everyone to think of questions kind of as I read, because I'd like to take questions at the end. But he's a character that is, in my mind, he reminds me of Hagrid from Harry Potter. He's kind of the magical creature that introduces Marissa to Fairyland, but at the same time he's a little bit more of a parental figure to her. Hold on there, little Fae, Chippen smiled sideways at her. You don't think you're flying there, do you? He let out a small chirpy laugh. I'm much faster than you, as you have already seen. Hop on. He lowered himself so she could mount him. She stared back dumbfounded. You want me to ride you? Marissa's mouth hung open. Isn't that, I don't know, beneath you or something? Not at all, Chippen said. Come on now, let's not waste time. I doubt that storm is too far off. He encouraged her to move with a soft nudge. Marissa stared at the emerald feathers. Or were they turquoise? She lowered herself onto his back and immediately felt the thrum of his wings through her whole body. She clenched her teeth to keep them from chattering. His feathers were like silk against her bare legs. Carefully, not wanting to hurt him, she searched for a place to hold on. She settled on a handful of feathers right at the place on his neck where the colors changed and tried to grip them without tugging too hard. Then, without warning, Chippen began to fly. So as I mentioned, he's a hummingbird, and hummingbirds are one of the fastest creatures that I could think of for a ferry to ride, which is the point of it. Also, I love hummingbirds. So now, what happens next in our story is Marissa and Chippen are going to team up, and on this particular instance, it's the same night, just maybe an hour later. They have fled from a storm and taken shelter in a nest up in a tree, and overheard some evil magical beings talking about a plot of some kind, and they get captured by these creatures. This is something not typical to, say, fairyland. If you're familiar with other stories about fairies or magical beings, the greylings that I created are purely from my imagination. They are, it never says this in the book, but they're also called kobolds, which is why the forest is called the Forest of Kobold. If you were to Google kobold, you would find pictures of what I imagine the greylings to look like. They're lizard-esque creatures. Without warning, the greylings stopped. They dumped the hostages from their backs, dropping them on the floor roughly. Marissa noted with the side of her face that the ground was cold and damp. Part of her seemed to be in a puddle, and she could feel her dress soaking through. Then she could feel hot breath on her, and she shivered in disgust. "Jackal, what are you doing?" Hawksley commanded. "Nothing," Jackal replied quickly, scurrying to his brother. "Stop smelling the girl and light a fire for me to see. Dev, find a spear." "But, brother," Jackal continued, "it's just she smells so funny, see? It's familiar. I knows I smelled it before, but not on a fairy, no." He licked his lips. "Doesn't matter now, Jackal. Do as I say." "Do as I say, do as I say. That's all I do as you says. But I says she smells wrong. Make me nervous, itchy like." Marissa shocked herself by saying, "I'm surprised you can smell anything over your own filthy stink." Then there was a moment of silence. Suddenly the cloth was ripped from her head and she could see again. They were in what appeared to be a cavern, underground, she presumed. The ceilings were low, which meant flying out of their reach would be impossible, and her hope for escape faded quickly. Chippen still had his head covered and was slumped on the floor a few feet away. He seemed unhurt, but it was hard to tell in this light. Then Hawksley pressed in even closer, forcing her to lean back into the cold wall. "What did you say, little bitty fairy?" he threatened. "I said I'm surprised you can smell anything over the stench of your own filthy stink," she repeated. Her voice was strong and clear. She heard Chippen murmur something under his breath. It was probably a warning not to anger their captors, but it was too late for that now. So this is where things start to pick up now that she's been captured. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit into the story. As much as I really wanted to read something of Sully the leprechaun, because he was one of my favorite characters to write, and also I enjoyed doing the Irish accent, I'm going to skip over that for today and let you read the book yourself. To me, it was more important today to introduce you to Griff, the third of what is to become a foursome. And he is the love interest in the story, although being that it is for a younger audience, a middle school age, as opposed to even YA, the love element, the relationships and stuff are pretty mild and tame. So he will become a love interest, but of course it's going to be very complicated. And this part of the story as well is written actually from Griff's perspective at first. So we're actually going to get to hear from his mind what Marissa is like. Griff was uncomfortable. He was swinging upside down in a thick net as it pressed heavily into his neck and forced his arm awkwardly behind his back. A small fairy with a tattered and dirty purple dress flew out of her hiding place towards him. As she got closer, he noticed a streak of ice blue in her otherwise black hair. A vibrant green hummingbird followed her. "Chippen," the fairy called, "help me undo this. This isn't the shuck. We've got to get the trap ready again. Hurry." So he had been caught in a trap meant for a shuck. Well, that's embarrassing. "Oi," Griff yelled. "What are you playing at? Let me go." She sneered in his general direction. I'm trying, if you just give me a second. She was yanking away at the knots with her tiny fingers, making no progress. Oh, just cut the rope, little girl. If I cut it, then I can't reuse it for the shuck now, can I? She paused briefly before mumbling, and I'm not a little girl. She stretched herself taller as she continued to work. Griff looked at her in surprise. He hadn't realized he'd spoken out loud. Oops, he smirked. What's your name, fairy? Never you mind, you ruined my trap, she answered accusingly. It wasn't very good anyway, thought Griff vindictively. Well, it trapped you, didn't it, she snapped. Besides, I only had a short time to get it ready, okay? And at least now we know it works, right, Chippen? I never had any doubts, the hummingbird replied, his eyes darting around on high alert. The girl tugged and pulled at the knots with her fingers, biting her lip as she worked. Slow down, Griff ordered, you're only making it worse. I can't slow down, she said, glancing up. We don't know when the shuck will be back. She returned to untangling the knots, but she did begin to work more carefully and with more of a determined focus. Griff watched her curiously. Her skin was such an unusual color, like bronze, only somehow deeper. And she was so small. Why on earth would this little fairy want to take on a shuck? It's not that I want to, she said slowly. It's my side of a magical contract. I have to kill this shuck, or... Well, I don't know exactly what would happen, but I don't think I want to find out either. Griff stared at her, not sure what was happening, so he answered her simply, You'd die. She froze, holding the ends of the rope. Then she looked over at the bird behind her. Chippen, is that true? Griff rolled his eyes. She didn't believe him. Well, I don't know you, do I? She barked at him. The bird called Chippen answered gently. Yes, it's true, Marissa. Fae who break their word on a magical contract are turned to stone. Forever, he added. Any other questions?
You mentioned that your students
Yeah.
and you're inspired you
Yeah.
in this work. Is it simply the breadth of imagination that a child can display? Because you're doing much the same thing,
Yeah.
creating a world of your own, right?
Yeah. Actually, I had two students, Maddie and Christina, who I have worked with for probably the last 6 or 7 years. And when they were still really young, well, younger than they are now, I guess, because I would say they're grade 7 now. So they were pretty little at the time, and they were playing at recess and running around making little fairy homes in the yard. And that's what inspired me to write about fairies. So it wasn't just their imagination, it was, oh, well, this is what kids might enjoy reading about. So that's what originally inspired the thought. And I had another student from the same place. Her name is Eden, and she got to have a character named after her. She is nothing like the character in the book. I just really loved her name. So if you are reading the book, know that it is pronounced Eden and not Eden, as you may think. Any other questions?
Are you doing this same idea at other libraries?
I did one reading in the Vancouver Library at the Britannia branch on Commercial Drive back a month and a half ago, and we do have another one scheduled at the Central branch in Vancouver, which I've never been to because it's in a scary neighborhood. But that one apparently gets a lot more foot traffic, and we're going to do that on January 11th. Yeah.
There's a sequel?
There will be. It is unwritten at the moment. It is formulated in my head, and I've started writing it during NaNoWriMo in November, National Novel Writing Month, but I started the month sick, so I didn't end up getting very far with it then. But it's actually going to be a trilogy. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, who reads fantasy that's one book anymore?
Right.
There's always 7, right? Yeah.
Did you bounce up any of your ideas off other people?
Alex mostly. This was still during his recovery process from the accident, so we were doing a lot of long walks and often at night, and so I would bounce ideas off of him all the time. I still do. Yeah.
But very much original.
Yeah. Oh, Alex
just
loves to
hope-
give me ideas that I love to shoot right down.
Yes. Yes. Very much all original.
Yeah. Mom, you had a question?
I did. Was there a difficult part of the book to write? Something that was harder than others?
There were several. The first draft went pretty smoothly. It's when you start trying to edit it that you're like, oh, well, this is garbage. I need to change this. And then there's certain parts you realize you have to edit 20 or 30 times before you like it. For me, the most challenging sections of the book to write was chapter 1, because having a strong opening that starts in the middle of the action, isn't too descriptive, is really challenging. But at the same time, you have to get all that important information out. And in fantasy, because it's world building as well, you have a lot more information, and what you need to avoid is that information dump right at the start. No one's invested yet. So chapter 1 was hard, and I gotta say, it's entirely different from my first draft. Chapter 1 originally could have been its own book, and it was really, I would have called it The History or The Origin of Fairies, and it was really just kind of the world building. Other parts that were really tricky, for me, the moment when she meets Griff, one of the reasons I chose to read that today is it was one of the hardest areas to write. I don't know if you picked up on it, but Marissa replies a lot to things that he was thinking. So we discover in the book that they have a mind-reading connection that is unheard of in Fairyland. It's certainly not normal. And hearing things from the other person's perspective and jumping into two people's minds all of a sudden, that got really tricky to write and can be very disconcerting. I cut off today right when we switch from Griff's perspective back to Marissa's. And often in fantasy or in any book, they do, chapter by chapters from a different character. But this was an instance where I just needed a moment in Griff's mind so we could understand what was happening, and then had to switch back to Marissa. That was really tricky. And I didn't read anything of Zara's today, and she's the fourth in the foursome, but everything of hers was hard to write. Her backstory and relationship with Marissa was so complicated and complex that the first couple times, and it's all dialogue, it's just her talking for a chapter and a half, telling everything about Marissa's past. And writing that in a realistic way was challenging, but then also making her not weak, because she is not a weak character. She is one of the absolute strongest fairies in existence, but this is her in her weakest moment, and making her come across as a strong person in a weak moment was another really big challenge. Good question. Alex?
So, being that you self-published this book, how did you find that whole experience?
I hated it. I didn't want to self-publish it because I didn't want to have to do all the extra work. I would like to just do the writing, and I would like someone else to edit it and design the cover photos and do the marketing and the publicity, because I am not a business person and I don't really want to be. So I had to learn a lot of skills. Just this year, 3 weeks before we published, I had to learn everything about formatting and publishing. And because we did it pretty quickly, and then there was all the marketing and promoting and stuff that I was basically learning as I went. I certainly made lots of mistakes, and I could probably write a book just on things I did wrong and how you could do better. But that's how you learn, so I don't really mind. I just know that the work that's associated with actually publishing it is intense and not my favorite part. Yeah. Does anyone have any other questions? Mom again.
Yeah. Were there any characters in your book based on people that we know?
Like people in this room? The short answer...
Only a mother would ask.
Yeah. The short answer is no. Marissa herself, I based her physically off of a combination of a friend of mine in Vancouver and myself. And that was way back when I wasn't even sure this was going to be a novel. I actually thought it was going to be much shorter, kind of like a Charlotte's Web type book, with a few pictures illustrated here and there. My friend is an illustrator, so I thought I'll model the character after her. Just physically, short black hair and darker skin. But I made her exceptionally short, partially because I'm short, and also because I needed Marissa to have particularly humanistic qualities to her. You will find out why. And so Marissa was very vaguely based off of a friend in Vancouver. But no one in the book was specifically anyone personal. If anything, I related them in my mind to other characters from other books, but they were all kind of combinations, the way that Chippen is a combination of Hagrid and any type of parental type of figure. Yeah.
Your detail in description is really, really exceptional.
I have a great English teacher to thank for that.
No. But have you ever considered, or did you actually illustrate your characters?
If I was a better artist, I would have. And I gave the first 3 chapters of the first draft to my friend, the artist, hoping that she would do some illustrations of them. At this point, I don't have anything specific. I get my inspiration visually from Google Google Images, but I would love to see eventual fan art of people, characters in the book. I drew myself little pictures, but they're not good. I would never put them out there.
Because you could when you're reading, you could visualize them.
Yes, I have to be able to see them in my mind to write it properly.
And I have a second part to my question. Your conversation and your dialogue, do you find that you have to say it out loud? Or
You should always do that. I basically had to Google how to write a book as I was doing this too.
to
And
make it real?
yeah,
you know?
one of the main things people say when writing is dialogue is especially tricky. Read it out loud so you know it sounds right. I probably would have done that anyway as an actor. And for me, I actually found dialogue was probably the one thing in writing I didn't find really tricky. And that probably has to do with some of the scripts writing that I've done and all the improv in my acting background. Just getting used to inhabiting a character's mind really fast and how they would say something. So that part was actually pretty easy for me, but yes, I read the dialogue out loud a lot, but I also read every chapter out loud multiple times during the process just to make sure it all sounded right. Yeah. Alex.
Okay, I just wanted to mention, it looks like some of the young readers in the room won't even put it down, so that's a good thing, right?
That's a great thing. That's what I want. If you
budge while you were reading.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was watching.
So my questions are regarding when can we expect another one? And if not here today, what's the best place to get it?
Yeah, well, I have, I think about 10 copies to have here today if anyone needs to get one. I also I work with kids, and I've learned from them that they often don't have money for books, especially in Vancouver. It doesn't seem like people spend money on books. I ask kids where they get things, and they're just like, the library. So the local library here has 2 copies, one in the YA section and one in the local author section. So if you don't want to buy a copy or can't, please feel free, pick it up from the library. Tell people it's here and get them to lend it out. And I do sell it on Amazon as well. And because it is Christmas time and I wanted to make sure there was no one who couldn't afford the book, I have put a special promotion on it until the end of December as well. Yes?
Lauren, I'm afraid I walked in a few minutes late, so
fine.
what age?
Oh, I never said that in the first place. I classify it as a middle grade novel. So it's intended for a slightly younger audience than YA, which is typically up to 18 years old. And I would say this is probably in the 9 to 14 range. Yeah, it depends on readers. I have kids I teach who are 8 who insist that they want to read it now. If kids read up in age level anyway. So generally I'd say 9 to 14. Baba?
I won't tell you my age, but I'll tell you.
That's true. You know what? The YA and all of that is just a recommendation. I'm well out of that range, but I read primarily YA novels still at this point too.
Yeah, it was a good book.
And I think it's because it's about people finding out who they really are, like kind of coming into themselves and identity, and we don't always know that right away. So the themes of finding yourself are often relatable at any age. Alex.
What would you say to anyone who's interested or has been thinking about writing their own book for perhaps many, many, many years, like myself?
I would say I was in the same category a few years ago, saying, I always want to write a novel. I'm going to do that one day before I die. And then I realized that the only thing that separates people that say that from authors are the people that actually go ahead and do it. You don't even have to publish it. You can just finish it. Just write something and expect that the first draft of it is going to be terrible. And then just rewrite it. Just get the words on paper once, rewrite it, and then even if you do nothing with it, you've done it. It's done. You have it finished. You've completed something pretty awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Piggybacking off of Alex, how did you start? Did you come home from work one day and say, okay, I'm sitting down and I'm going to start my book?
No, I think I wrote the first chapter in my head, kind of as we were walking one day, I don't even think we were talking, I was just kind of running through things in my mind. When I got home, I was so inspired by that I sat down and wrote the first chapter. And it was after that I went on Google and how to write a book. Because I was like, I've got a chapter, but I don't know what to do next. How do I structure a story, a full story, and make it into something readable? And that, as I said, the first chapter is non-existent. It's not in this book anymore. It's completely changed since the first time I wrote it. But the basic formula that worked for me was I found something that said you need 3 mini climaxes or mini conflicts before you have a main conflict. I knew what my main conflict was, so I was like, what are 3 points that could get me there? And from there, I just kind of wrote a very, maybe 2-paragraph summary of what was going to happen, which then fleshed out into 2 or 3 pages, which then became a chapter by chapter outline. And it all changed as I went. It did not stay the same. By chapter 6, I was like, oh, but this needs to happen, and that would be great. So I feel like it came together pretty well, and that there's not a lot of loose ends in this book other than what I plan to tie up in book 2 or 3. Book 2 is entitled Outlaw, by the way. As by the end of this book, they are absolutely outlaws. But as I said, it's not done. Alex?
Last question from me. Being there with you throughout the process, I saw how hard it can be and some of the trials and tribulations that you went through. What do you think was the most enjoyable part about jumping into this new venture, though?
I like the writing part. I like the sitting down. I like and actually putting words on paper.
Meditative or?
No. It's when it starts flowing naturally that it starts to feel really. It starts to feel really good. And for me, that was probably chapters like 3 to 6. All just kind of came out at once, and they did not get changed much. They stayed. Other than the meeting of Griff and all the craziness with the point of view, it didn't change a whole lot in that section because it just flowed so naturally. And a lot of that came from having more characters, which meant having more dialogue by that point. Yeah.
Nice to hit a creative ore body and just...
Yeah, that's what it is for me. It's another form of creating something. I just realized one day that I didn't really care if acting was the way I was creating. It just had to be creative in some way. And as long as I'm making something that wasn't there before, it felt really good.
Did you actually write it, or did you do it on paper?
I typed. I brainstormed on paper. A lot of character notes and ideas were written on paper, but then everything was typed after that. Some people do write by hand. I would never have the patience to type it up after, is the honest truth. Josh?
Basically, your writing process, do you find you kind of become a recluse, or do you like being out with people? Because I find there was an article about that.
I was pretty reclusive during it. I didn't even have a space to write when I did this. I was probably 70% of the time I was writing my book. I was either on my bed with my laptop on my lap or on my couch with my laptop on my lap. I bought a desk since then, so for book 2 and 3 I can sit at a desk. But I was often just kind of in my zone. I know a lot of people listen to music and things while they write. I can't do any of that. I just, don't bother me.
Making your space really helped, though, didn't it?
I haven't found it helped creatively. I certainly haven't had as much inspiration yet, but I don't think that's the space. I think that's because I've been reading a lot lately, and it's hard to put my books down and jump into my own world again. Yeah, I should have just continued right away. While I was still so immersed in it, I couldn't get it out. And now I've got other books in my head.
I think we're all fairly confident.
Yeah. All right, well, if there's no other questions, then I'm going to take a seat, and I'll be available for books for purchase if you'd like to get one here today, or to sign your copy if you have one with you.